Hello, and welcome to this training on human trafficking in Montana. Human trafficking, otherwise known as modern-day slavery, is a crime that happens everywhere, even throughout our state. Through this training, you will be able to recognize, respond, and report human trafficking. There are several learning objectives for this course. First, we will define what human trafficking is. Then, we will look at the size and scope of human trafficking across the globe, in the United States, and here in Montana. We will then distinguish between the myths and realities of human trafficking and learn how to recognize a victim. By the end of this training, you will have practical ways you can respond to and report on human trafficking in your own community. Human trafficking became a federal crime in 2000 with the passing of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA. There are two types of human trafficking: labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Sex trafficking is a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. Let's think of human trafficking as an equation. We use the model action means purpose to describe the crime. In order for human trafficking to take place, there needs to be an action, such as inducing, recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining of a person through force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of commercial sex or labor or services. It is important to note here that unlike labor trafficking, if a person under 18 years of age has performed a commercial sex act, there is no need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. Human trafficking is one of the fastest growing criminal industries in the world, second only to drug trafficking. Unlike a drug, which is only sold once, human trafficking victims can be sold over and over again. Because there is very little risk and high demand, human trafficking generates high profits. Victims are seen as a commodity rather than a human being, and are easily exploited and treated as disposable. Imagine your son, daughter, neighbor, or friend treated as the property of another person. This is the reality of human trafficking. Human trafficking affects people all across the globe, from every country, race and ethnicity, age, gender, and socioeconomic status. According to the International Labor Organization, 40.3 million people were trafficked in 1 year. Of these, 1 in 4 victims were children. Data on human trafficking in the United States is hard to find due to the crime's hidden nature. Despite this, there are several organizations working to collect accurate data. The National Human Trafficking Hotline tracks the number of calls and cases of human trafficking reported to the hotline each year. According to their data, they have received information on over 8,000 cases of human trafficking on an annual basis. According to the U.S. Department of State, over 800 investigations involving human trafficking were opened by the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice opened over 750 investigations involving human trafficking, both within 1 year. The numbers from the Department of State come from the federal level, without taking into account the amount of calls and investigations opened by the state and municipal law enforcement. In Montana, we have increased our efforts to understand the amount of human trafficking in our state. Since the passage of new legislation in 2015, we have been able to take positive steps toward the eradication of human trafficking. This chart illustrates the amount of sex trafficking advertisements listed online in 2016 and 2017. In 2017, we see that Billings had 23,506 advertisements, Missoula had 7,799, Bozeman 7,082, Great Falls 4,184, Kalispell with 3,302, Helena with 3,055, Butte 3,136, and lastly, all other advertisements with a total of 14,815. These numbers are difficult to wrap our heads around. How can so much of this happen when we don't see it in our daily lives? It is difficult to understand the amount of human trafficking because it is an invisible crime. It happens right under our noses. Human trafficking victims are the students walking our hallways, our homeless or runaway youth, our seasonal workers. It happens in the everyday places we go: parks, restaurants, gas stations, hotels, and more. Victims of human trafficking are our neighbors. Remember, human trafficking does not discriminate. Anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, regardless of age, gender, race and ethnicity, education, or socioeconomic background. So let's dig a little deeper into the types of human trafficking. First, let's talk about labor trafficking. There are several myths associated with labor trafficking. The most common myth is that labor trafficking is the transportation of people across a border. Human trafficking is about the exploitation of a person. A border crossing is not necessary to prove that trafficking has occurred. While the majority of labor trafficking victims are foreigners, they are also U.S. citizens. In fact, a study released by the National Institute of Justice found that 82% of victims working in agriculture were U.S. citizens. Victims of labor trafficking experience multiple forms of exploitation, including physical and sexual violence, discrimination, and withholding of identification papers such as a Social Security card, birth certificate, or passport. Victims of labor trafficking are also paid little, or wages are withheld altogether. They may be unable to provide their address. Victims often exhibit poor physical health, including malnourishment and untreated medical needs, such as broken bones. This is often due to long working hours without adequate breaks, food, or water. Victims suffer from poor living conditions and may be required to live in the housing that the employer provides. It is common that victims of labor trafficking owe a large sum of money to the employer that they are unable to pay off. Victims are also controlled by the trafficker and are unable or fearful of speaking on their own. Labor trafficking takes place in a variety of sectors, including construction, agriculture, manufacturing, door-to-door sales and begging, hospitality, restaurants, and domestic servitude, such as nannying and housekeeping. We are often the consumers of products made by the hands of labor trafficking victims. Think of the things you buy: coffee, tea, electronics, fruits and vegetables, clothing, etc. At some point, the item you purchased has probably come into contact with a victim of labor exploitation. Why don't labor trafficking victims leave? Victims are fearful of harm to friends and family members. They experience guilt and shame about what has happened to them. Foreign victims fear unauthorization and deportation. A lack of identification papers makes it difficult for victims of labor trafficking to find a job, receive health and food benefits, and secure housing. Leaving is also challenging because victims have no money for transportation, food, and clothing. The money they need in order to leave has been withheld by the trafficker. Since our understanding of labor trafficking is limited, resources for survivors are more difficult to find. Here is an example of a labor trafficking scenario. A police officer pulls over a truck for speeding on I-94. Inside the truck there are 3 men, one in front and 2 others in the back seat. The men in the back look very tired, appear malnourished, and have small cuts and scrapes on their arms and hands. They are reluctant to look at the officer and seem nervous. When the officer asks for identification papers, the driver opens the glove box and hands over all 3 IDs. In this scenario, there are several red flags. First, The driver has control over each person's identification papers. While this may seem minor, no one should have control over another adult's ID. In addition, the two men in the back show signs of poor work conditions and an insufficient diet. Their nervousness around the officer may be attributed to a labor trafficking victim's fear of getting arrested. While in isolation, these red flags are not indicative of trafficking. However, when combined, they may be signs of a labor trafficking case. Let's take a look at sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is the exploitation of a person for the purposes of commercial sex. In contrast to the common belief that sex trafficking takes place elsewhere, such as in Las Vegas or New York City, trafficking can happen anywhere, even in our Montana communities. The truth is, trafficking happens wherever there is a demand, and that includes both our large cities and rural areas, and anywhere in between. While it may seem that a person made a choice, it is common that what they initially agreed upon was different than what they were made to do. Victims may also have started due to a lack of choices to provide for their basic needs. Sex trafficking victims are not only females, there are also men and boys, as well as LGBTQ and other minority populations. While anyone is susceptible to being trafficked, there are several groups at higher risk. These groups include runaway or homeless youth, LGBTQ, those with disabilities, a history of trauma, and living in poverty. Youth in the foster care system or living in group homes are also vulnerable. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 1 in 7 runaways were likely victims of sex trafficking in 1 year. We also know that here in Montana, trafficking takes place between friends and family members. This is often the case when the family is in need of something, such as basic necessities, money, or drugs. For example, a mother and grandmother here in Montana sold their 11-year-old girl in exchange for money to pay the rent. American Indian women and girls are particularly vulnerable to sex trafficking due to high rates of poverty, unemployment, homelessness, substance use, and domestic violence. Graduation rates and academic proficiency levels of American Indian youths in Montana are lower than those of their peers. American Indians are also at higher risk due to racial discrimination and intergenerational trauma as a result of colonialization, which includes relocation, boarding schools, and restrictive legislation. For example, in Minnesota, 105 American Indian prostitutes were interviewed about their experiences, and 79% said they had experienced sexual violence during adolescence, and more than 2/3 of the women had relatives who attended boarding schools. Grooming, or the introduction into the sex trade, often begins with a false promise, such as a job opportunity, travel, or a romantic relationship. Traffickers target vulnerabilities, such as low self-esteem, a lack of physical or emotional support, or a history of abuse and neglect. They also use phrases such as, "I love you," "You have great potential," and "I'll take care of you," to boost a victim's confidence. Traffickers also provide gifts such as expensive clothing or accessories to demonstrate their affection. Victims often form an emotional and/or romantic bond with the trafficker. During this initiation period, the trafficker will try to isolate the victim from others by persuading them that the trafficker is the only person they can trust. Once they have isolated the person from friends and family members, the trafficker will begin to manipulate the person for their own financial gain. Here are some indicators that your friend, child, or neighbor is being groomed. The presence of an older boyfriend or girlfriend, expensive gifts or clothing that they otherwise would be unable to afford, decreased school attendance, and a notable change in behavior. Traffickers recruit victims through many venues. These include social media, transportation such as bus and train stops, parks, restaurants or cafes, concerts, sports, among friends, or within a dating relationship. Victims may also be recruited at group homes, as youth in these homes have a significant history of trauma. There are many indicators of sex trafficking. Trafficking victims may appear fearful, timid, or submissive. Victims may also seem defensive, acting in an angry or violent manner. This is especially the case when they are in the presence of any authority figure. Victims defer to another person to speak, or appear coached on what to say. It is common for victims to lie about their name or age, and be unsure of their location. Sex trafficking victims often have several phones or electronic devices, one of which is constantly beeping with texts or calls. Victims lack identification papers and have limited personal possessions. They may appear malnourished and have untreated medical issues, such as bruises or cuts, and broken bones which may not have healed properly. Victims may also show signs of domestic violence or substance use. They have trouble making eye contact, especially around males. Victims refer to their trafficker as their boyfriend or daddy, and may refer to other girls in the same group or stable run by the trafficker as a wifey or wife-in-law. Youth make sexual comments that are atypical of their age. Traffickers will also brand their victims as a sign of control and ownership. These are often a tattoo of a crown, the trafficker's name, a $sign, or a barcode. Here are a few examples. Sex trafficking takes place wherever there is a demand, and several common locations include hotels, truck stops, private residences, strip clubs, and illicit massage parlors. Buyers of commercial sex are not the people we think of as bad guys. They are the men you see on a regular basis, including married men, lawyers, clergy, business professionals, and physical laborers such as construction workers and oil industry workers. We refer to the men who buy sex as Johns, as their identities are anonymous. We live in a culture where violence against women and minorities is normalized, and this makes the purchase of someone for sex more acceptable. Why do victims of sex trafficking stay? Victims have an emotional and psychological bond to the trafficker. They trust the trafficker, despite the violence they have experienced. In some cases, particularly with those who have had a history of abuse and neglect, the life a victim has with a trafficker is better than what they had before. At least they are being paid for the acts a friend or family member took for free. Perhaps they are receiving more attention and support than they were before. Victims are often fearful of further harm by the trafficker if they leave. Traffickers use shame as a control tactic, using threats such as releasing the footage of sex acts to friends and family members, or stating that they are not good enough for anyone else. No one will ever love them more than the trafficker does. They also lack identification, such as a social security card or birth certificate, which makes it difficult to find a job or get access to social services, such as food benefits and fair housing. Many victims often have a criminal record. In order to separate themselves from the abuse they are experiencing, substance use is common. Since victims are dependent on the trafficker to provide for their physical needs, they lack the life skills to live independently. These skills include grocery shopping, driving, and renting an apartment. This is particularly true of adolescent trafficking victims. Victims also have a high distrust of law enforcement and social service providers. Resources tailored toward survivors of sex trafficking are limited, especially within our state. The impact of trafficking on American Indians is often overlooked. American Indian victims need culturally appropriate services, which are minimal. Additionally, American Indian victims experience higher rates of traumatic brain injury and stress disorders, of which racism is a factor. Here is an example of a sex trafficking scenario. Amber, a young teenager, befriends an older male, Fred, on social media. They talk, and he invites her to model at his friend's studio in Billings. Amber is excited. She has always wanted to have a career in modeling. When they arrive, Amber finds out that it is not what she had anticipated. Fred and his friend want to do a pornography shoot, and Amber is uncomfortable. Fred convinces her that she will only need to pose a few times, and then they can start taking other photos. Amber hesitantly agrees. When Fred wants to take more photos, Amber refuses. Fred and his friend threaten to send the photos to friends and family members if she does not cooperate. Not wanting the shame of having her friends and family view the photos, she complies. Eventually, through threats of harm to herself and her loved ones, Amber is forced to perform commercial sex acts. In this scenario, Fred, or Amber's trafficker, has used fraud, the job offer, and coercion, the threats, to induce Amber to perform commercial sex acts. Because Amber is a minor performing these acts, she is automatically a victim of sex trafficking. Human trafficking is complex because it includes so many different forms of abuse, from physical and sexual violence to psychological manipulation. The trauma from these experiences lasts a lifetime, creating a multitude of consequences, including long-term health problems, PTSD and depression, substance abuse and eating disorders, as well as a lower socioeconomic status and a deterioration of self-worth. So what can you do? There are several things you can do to combat human trafficking. Be aware of the risk factors and indicators in your own community. Educate and engage your friends, family, and community members on human trafficking, as well as the harmful effects of purchasing commercial sex. Find out how the items you purchase are made. To prevent human trafficking, volunteer in your schools, youth programs, and family strengthening programs. Support a local or national organization that is fighting human trafficking, such as your local task force. Assist your local domestic violence shelter so that they can expand services tailored toward victims of human trafficking. These are only a few examples. There are many more ways to take action. If you or someone you know has been a victim of human trafficking, do not be afraid to report. Victims and survivors of human trafficking are treated with care and will not be penalized for what they have gone through. Now that you know how to recognize it, respond and report. If you think you might have seen a human trafficking situation, do not confront it directly. Instead, call your local law enforcement, 911, or the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-3737-888. You can also text HELP to 233-733. We are Montana Strong. Together we can end human trafficking.